Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to McDonough Gym, and more importantly, welcome to the 2024 Marino Family International Writers Academic Workshop. We do this every year. It's my favorite event. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. And this is a new student tradition that many before you experience as you will experience it today. We have had, in my opinion, a terrific set of days together, and I know you've been doing NSO stuff nonstop since I saw you at Convocation. You've had a lot of different meetings, but this is a special meeting for us. We assemble today for what could be called a scholarly event, a time for literary appreciation. And this fits with the kind of messages you got at Convocation. We spoke about your journey as students of Georgetown. We wanted to provide you with these early days with a foundation of the events you're going to experience, motivation to ask questions, to address questions while you're here about yourself, about your academic pursuits and the contributions that you might make in a unique way for our world. And as I said then, to be successful here, we hope you'll learn to question your own beliefs, to examine ideas and perspectives that are new to you, to consider alternative ways of thinking. As I said, the ability to see the world the way others see it is a superpower. And you need to talk to others and interact with others and interact with other ideas to acquire this superpower. Today's workshop is precisely an exercise designed to help you do that. For almost 30 years, the Marino workshop has been a foundational element of our new student orientation. All of our incoming students participate in this shared intellectual experience. And we have two people to thank for this, plus others in their family. Peggy and Fred Marino, if you could stand briefly. You need to know that for 29 years, this couple and their children have sponsored this workshop. Often they attend, often the full family attends, and we thank them for making this possible. I also want to recognize our Dean of the Library, Harriet Hamasi. Harriet, if you could stand, please. I want to thank her colleagues and the members of the Marino Workshop Committee for organizing this gathering. If you've never done something like this, if you've never organized an event like this, you don't know that there are thousands of details. It doesn't come together by accident, and we thank all the scores of faculty and staff who've worked over the past months to make it happen. So they are instrumental both in enabling this event, but also in selecting this year's book, What Strange Paradise, written by the journalist and author Omar El Akkad. 3 student interviewers will guide today's discussion. I'd like to introduce and thank each of them, and maybe you could stand, although I've lost you. Oh, there you are. First, Grace Nuri, a member of the Georgetown College of Arts and Sciences, class of 2026. Nami Bolat, a member of Georgetown College of Arts and Sciences, class of 2025. Nori. Aayush Murarka, a member of the School of Foreign Service, class of 2026. So we've asked them to take part in this exercise with you so that they can model the deep intellectual engagement that you will come to experience in your courses here. No pressure, guys. After the discussion, you, our audience, will contribute your own questions. We have a mic right in the middle of the aisle here. Paul Ely the senior fellow at Georgetown's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, will lead the Q&A. Thank you for that, Paul. Over the course of this workshop, we've had the privilege of welcoming many distinguished authors. Our author today is a critically acclaimed journalist whose works explore complex humanitarian crises through deeply researched and richly imaginative storytelling. He was born in Egypt, raised in Qatar and Canada. His writing has taken him around the world as he explores issues of human rights, social justice, community, and belonging. For 10 years, he served as a staff reporter for the Globe and Mail in Canada, where he covered a broad range of topics from armed conflict in Afghanistan and Egypt, to military trials at Guantanamo Bay, to racial injustice and the climate crisis. His journalism has been recognized by the Gough Penny Award and Canada's National Newspaper Award for Investigative Journalism. In 2017, his debut novel, American War, was translated into more than a dozen languages and was listed as among the best books of the year by the New York Times and the Washington Post. The book that we'll discuss today, What Strange Paradise, was the winner of the 2021 Scotiabank Giller Prize, and it takes us on an imaginative journey through Syria, Egypt, and Greece, exploring human relationships during global crises. The book tells the story of Amir, a young Syrian boy who survives the sinking of a ship carrying him and other refugees. After washing up on the shore of an island, he encounters a young local teenage girl, Vanna. Both characters grapple with questions of home and belonging. As they travel across the island in search of safety, we see them encounter different people who challenge their perspectives. In What Strange Paradise, we explore the universal threads that bind us together, the interconnectedness of all our stories. The book offers a challenge. How can we feel more connected to stories that might seem distant from us? El Akkad explains, quote, "All of my books are in some way related to the idea of asking the reader to simply not look away," close quote. His books invoke empathy. He said of some of his characters, quote, "You can understand why somebody does something, and you can explore their reasons for doing it without taking their side," close quote. At Georgetown, you now know this is a challenge you must take up. To try out different perspectives, ask questions, listen, and assume the goodwill of all parties in the conversation. This is what will be required for the leaders of the future, and it's the work that we begin now together. We hope that what you do here this afternoon in our time with Omar El Akkad and in conversation with this novel will enable you to better understand your own story, your own capacity for imagination, your own connection to the stories of others. This is your task that comes with membership in this academic community. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for your engagement. Now let me turn it over to our distinguished author, Omar El Akkad.
Appreciate it. Please. How y'all doing today? No, that's okay. That is appropriate. I was doing an event once. It'll shock you to learn that this is not my normal audience size. I'm more in the sort of 3 to 4 person range when I do my book events. And I was doing one event once at a bookstore where there was literally 3 people sitting right here. And I started off by saying, so how's everybody doing? And the gentleman sitting right where you are, sir, said, just looked at me and was like, eh. I was like, thank you, sir. That is the appropriate atmosphere for what's about to happen. It's such a privilege to be here with you all today. Thank you so much, Provost Groves, for that incredibly generous introduction. I try to begin these things by giving people a sense of my wider body of work, if you're not familiar with it. For those of you who don't know much about my writing, I specialize in stone-cold bummers, just the most depressing things you will ever read. If you want to ruin your day, you can try either of my novels, any of the short stories. You can come and talk to me. My personality has a similar effect. To give you a sense of what I'm talking about, I often tell the story of the Chinese edition of my debut novel, American War. After this book came out, I got an email from my publisher saying that there was a publisher in China that wanted to acquire the rights for the Chinese market. I said, sure, great. And the only thing I knew about this publisher was that they didn't like the title American War. They were going to change it to something else. I didn't know what that was. Well, fast forward a few months later, I get a copy of the completed edition. Obviously, I can't read what's on the cover, but I find a friend of mine who can, and I go to him and I say, hey man, what does it say on this cover? And he looks at it and he says, it says nobody survives. So spoiler alert, if you haven't read American War, that's what you're in for. So grateful to be in this room and for y'all reading this novel. This is my second one. It's called What Strange Paradise. One of the fun things you get to do when you're an author is invent a very clean Genesis story after the fact for how the book came to be. You know, this happened, then I wrote a book. In reality, these are really messy things. You know, it takes years and years and tons of wrong turns. And you know, I suspect all of you have had some version of this with your essays or assignments where it's like you open a folder and it's just like, draft 1, 2, final for real final this time, and then 6, and it's just folders and folders of that, But the closest thing I have to a Genesis story for this book took place in 2012. I was still working as a journalist at the time, and I was back in Egypt covering the aftermath of the Arab Spring. Egypt is where I was born and where my family's from, but I had to get out of there when I was 5. My dad had to get the hell out of the country, and I have a very sort of conflicted relationship with that place as a result. And I have a conflicted relationship with all places as a result. There's no geography, there's no set of stories, there's no one thing I can point to and say, this is mine. And as a result, all my books in one way or another, all my stories, everything I write is about a sense of unrootedness, which is in many ways the exact opposite of what my favorite authors do. So when I think of someone like Naguib Mahfouz, for example, who's sort of the most well-known Arab author of the last 100 years, that guy knew Egypt. He knew Cairo down to the bone, and that's what he wrote about. There is nowhere on earth with which I have the same relationship. And so not only do I not have that man's talent, but I also just don't have the life that allows me to write the kind of books I love to read, which is, again, a very weird place to be. But I was back in Egypt, and I was covering the aftermath of the Arab Spring, and I was driving around town with an old high school buddy of mine who had also come back to Egypt. And he was complaining about the most universal thing there is, the rent. The rent's too high, the rent's getting too high. And at one point I said, well, what's the price for an apartment in your building, for example? And he said, well, do you mean the locals' price or do you mean the Syrians' price? I was like, hold on a second, what the hell's the Syrians' price? What are you talking about? And he said, well, we've had this influx of refugees come in recently, and you can charge them 3 times as much. I mean, what are they going to do? Are they going to go somewhere else? And just the casualness of that cruelty. And it quickly became apparent that it wasn't just this guy's apartment. This was, you go down to the fruit and vegetable vendor down the street, they recognize your accent, they put two and two together, they realize they can gouge you with essentially no consequences. That was the moment that I started thinking about the things that eventually congealed into this book. And it took a long time. It took the better part of 10 years, 5 drafts, somewhere in the range of 60,000 words in the trash can. But eventually it became this book. One of my favorite sort of literary minds of all time is Jorge Luis Borges. You can look up, he has a lecture series. He was in Harvard giving this lecture series towards the end of his life, where he was just talking about whatever the hell he wanted to talk about because he's Jorge Luis Borges and nobody was going to stop him. But at one point he was talking about the nature of all literature just being tricks. All literature is tricks. And no matter how clever your tricks are, they eventually get discovered. My tricks are not particularly clever. My central trick is inversion. I take something that's headed this way and I make it go that way. American War, my first novel, was an attempt to invert the gaze of the empire, I guess, for lack of a better term. So if you think of any James Bond movie you've ever seen, any Jason Bourne movie, there's always a car chase through a Moroccan bazaar, or there's a scene on an exotic Caribbean island, and it's fully understood that the place is the table, and the tablecloth being laid on top of it is someone else's story. I don't know how much you learned about North Africa from watching Casablanca, but the point is there's a table, it's the place, and there's a tablecloth and it's someone else's story. And all I wanted to do was invert that. I wanted to make this place the table, and I wanted to overlay someone else's story on it. And then 3 weeks after I finished the first draft of American War, which I don't think of as an American book, Donald Trump announced he was running for president. The book ends up coming out in early 2017, right at the beginning of the Trump administration, and it is read as an exclusively American book, which was great for my royalty statements. I made a ton of money and I sold a ton of copies as a result. But the book I intended to write and the book that was overwhelmingly read in this part of the world are two very different books, and I have no control over that. And with What Strange Paradise, I was trying to, again, go back to this idea of inversion. I wanted to take a comforting fable that Westerners have been telling their kids for the last 100 years, and I wanted to use it to tell a different kind of story. And I ended up settling on Peter Pan. Peter Pan is one of those stories that's been sort of Disney-fied over the years. The origins of Peter Pan are much darker than the thing you see in the movies. J.M. Barrie, the guy who wrote Peter Pan, when he was young, his brother died in a skating accident, I think a day short of his 14th birthday. And it crushed the family. His mother never recovered. But one of the things she would say to try and comfort herself is, well, at least he'll never grow old. That's the origin of Peter Pan. It's not Peter Pan syndrome. It's not the man who refuses to stop acting like a child. It's the child who never gets a chance to become a man. And that, to me, seemed the sort of perfect structural container for the story I was trying to tell. So I started writing this book, and at the time I was watching this lecture series. There's this Canadian literary critic named Northrop Frye who was talking about literature in the Bible, and it occurred to me that I had this sort of very New Testament, Old Testament thing going on with my story, where I had one story about an exodus from Egypt and one story about a miraculous rebirth of a child. And I thought, what if I tried to codify this in some way? And that's when I got this before and after chapter structure. We finished the final edits to the book during the COVID lockdown. I was sort of slowly losing my mind. I hadn't seen people in months. My editor was sort of holding this thing together very bravely. And it came out into the world to, with American War, I knew what it looked like when people were enthusiastic about a book because my publisher thought it was going to be the next Hunger Games. They thought it was going to sell millions of copies. Very little enthusiasm for this one. And I thought, okay, well, it's been a good career, and then I got very lucky with a positive New York Times review, and it won a couple of awards, and that sort of saved everything from going off the rails. Inevitably, when you've done something as stupid enough as dedicate many years of your life to a book, when you could have just as easily been learning how to play guitar or literally doing anything else, you're asked why. Like, why do this with your life? And the weird thing about the answer to that question is that you have to believe two different versions of it. You have to believe the lie and the truth of it. When you're writing, you have to believe the lie that this thing's going to change the world. You know, people are going to read this, and then the migrant crisis in the Mediterranean is going to come to an end. That's what's going to happen. The power of literature is going to cause people to see the inherent injustice. And you have to believe all of this, because you're alone in a room for years at a time. The second it goes out into the world, you have to rid yourself of any obligation that this does anything at all, because that's not the obligation of the writer. The obligation of the writer is to write. And if it just so happens that some minister in Greece picks this up and decides to completely change their worldview as a result, fantastic, but that has nothing to do with the process of putting a book out into the world. I was at a reading once where there was going to be 10 of us reading, and because the person arranging the reading knows what writers are like, he asked us to each read for 2 minutes, which is a ludicrous amount of time to ask anyone to read. It's like chapter 1, thank you very much, and you walk off the stage, right? But they knew that each writer pays no attention to time limits. And so we did our readings, and it was 2, 2, 2, 2. And the 10th guy wrote for 32 minutes. He got up on stage and he read for 32 minutes straight. I'm not going to do that to you today, I promise. The bad news is that I'm going to read you an entire chapter. The good news is it's the shortest chapter in the book. It's a page and a half, so we'll get through this together. This book steals from a lot of places. One of the great advantages of being a writer is that, I don't know if you know this, but when the copyright runs out on a piece of work, you can just steal from it as much as you want, and there's essentially no repercussions. This book steals from a lot of places. It steals from the two works quoted in the epigraph, Peter Pan, for the stage play and the book based on the stage play, but also a short story called An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, which, if you've read that short story, you probably have a rough idea of what you're getting yourself into structurally. I steal the structure of that story for this novel. But I also steal from the Odyssey. There's a lot from the Odyssey in here, which seemed like a fitting thing for a book based on a boat that is almost finding its way to Greece. It steals from Paradise Lost. It steals from one of the books of the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha are the books that almost made the Bible. In particular, a book called the Book of Nicodemus. I have yet to meet anybody who has read the Book of Nicodemus. I don't know why you would read the Book of Nicodemus, but it exists. And the central sort of conceit in that book is that it has an alternate telling of what happens to Jesus between death and resurrection. And the story in that book is that Jesus goes down into hell, meets everyone there, draws confession from everyone there, and works everyone's way out of hell. That is the central telling within the Book of Nicodemus. These references are all sort of sprinkled throughout the book, but the place where they're most concentrated is in the final before chapter, which is chapter 28. The moment you open this book, you know that it begins with the scene of a shipwreck. There's this migrant ship that's been crossing the Mediterranean. It's gone down in a storm. The sole survivor is a young boy named Amir. And then we work our way through to how that came to be. So this is the final before chapter, which is the moment the ship, the Calypso, which is this repurposed, rickety old fishing boat, the moment it goes down. And all you really need to know is that there's this ship, it's called the Calypso, the boy on the ship is named Amir, and this is the moment when the storm finally capsizes this boat. In the last moments, some held on dearly, leaving splinters of nail and streaks of blood between the boards. And although earlier the boat was filled with screaming, of these remaining few, none made a sound. Others, knowing now what was about to happen, what was inevitable, gave in, and without resistance were swept off the deck and into the water, and they too made no sound. In the distance, the island, the colored lights, the music. One final time, the waves lifted the calypso high. Under the force of a tumbling body, the mast snapped at its base. The sea overwhelmed, drowning the bloom of limbs that struggled to escape the lower quarters. Turning past the point of rebound, the old fishing boat flung its last few occupants still hanging on to the far starboard side into the air. For an instant, the deck became perpendicular to the surface of the water and then, like a closing eyelid, met it. Amir took flight, headlong into the seaborne sky, the roof of the great inverted world. In meeting him, the water was not cold or concussive, but warm and tranquil. Its temperature, the temperature of a body, the temperature of blood. With ease and without pain, he flew past the surface, past the depths, past the places where light and life surrendered and the domain of stillness began. And then lower, farther, past the crust of a million interlocking bodies who had braved this passage before him and come to rest at the bottom, sick with the secrets of their own unallowed mourning. Past the smallest flower-white bones, past the world at the feet of the world. To the lowest deep, then a lower deep still. Until finally, to a dry womb of a place in which were kept safe and unchanging everyone he had ever known, and everyone each of those had ever known, outward forever to encompass the whole of the living and the lived. And each of these the boy met in their old lives and their new lives waiting, and from each drew confession, and each he felt into as though there were no barrier between them, no silo of self to keep a soul waiting. What beautiful rebellion to feel into another, to feel anything at all. And then he surfaced. So Provost Grove said that a central part of what it is we're trying to do here is sort of step outside of your own eyeballs, step outside of yourself and experience someone else's reality. And I think that's obviously a central part of not just being in an institution like this, but of being human, of being in this world. And again, I have to sort of believe that anyone who lends me their eyeballs for 300 pages is willing to do that. But I think, and even though I can't tell you how depressing it is, by the way, to hear class of 2025 when I'm class of 05. That's so demoralizing. Anyway, despite the fact that I'm twice your age, I'm in no position to give you advice. The only thing I will say with respect to not just this work, not just literature, but engagement with the world in general, is that yes, it is absolutely important to feel outside of yourself, to engage with someone else's reality, even if it's entirely different from yours. But it is also very, very important to be cognizant of what the consequences are if you do none of that. Because to be in this, the most privileged part of the world, the most powerful country to have ever existed, comes with a certain set of privileges, and one of them for many, many people is that there are absolutely no consequences to looking away. There are absolutely no consequences to paying zero attention to the plight of someone who is not you, or someone who is not like you. And those two things go hand in hand. And so when I'm sitting down alone for months, years on end writing these things, the set of delusions that I have to sort of engage in, which may not be delusions, that I hope are not delusions, has to include the idea that human beings are willing not only to engage with the lived reality of people outside of themselves, but also willing to acknowledge the consequences or lack thereof of not looking at it. And once you see the world through those eyes, not so much what you are doing, but what you do not have to put up with, for example, it's a fundamental shift. And I would encourage you to think about that as you engage, even in this room, with people whose experiences might be vastly, vastly different from yours. And with that, I think I have rambled at you for the allotted time period or thereabout. So let's get to chat, and thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much for taking this time to sit with us today. We'd like to start by asking one of our most burning questions that we wondered as we read the book. So a lot of stories of refugees are published as anthologies or based on a collection of real events that happened. But What Strange Paradise, you took a different approach and wrote it as a fictional story. Why did you choose to write a fictional story caused by a real war and a real crisis rather than by a nonfiction one?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I was a journalist for a long time. It's the only job I've ever had. My university degree is in computer science. I can't program my way out of a paper bag. I never went to class. It was a bad life decision. Actually, one class I took was useful, discrete math and logic, purely because in one lecture, sorry, you've asked me a question, I've immediately gone on a random tangent. This is what's going to happen for the next hour, just a heads up. The professor was talking about true-false statements, true and true equals true, so on and so forth. And he said something I'll never forget. He said, from a false premise, you can imply anything. If the moon is made out of cheese, we are actually in Germany right now. Like that is, by terms of discrete logic, that is a correct statement. And that has stuck with me and has informed so much of my writing. I meet people who begin at that premise quite often and then just go wherever they want to go. In journalism, I found very quickly that the defining facet of the writing of journalism, I was in print journalism, and then the defining facet of nonfiction in general, but journalism in particular, is answers. If you don't have answers to the questions who, what, where, when, how, you don't have a piece of journalism. And that's fine, but I also have most of my life as questions. Fiction is where I go to sit with questions. There is no obligation on my part once I move into the realm of fiction to offer anything prescriptive. And anyone who's read this book knows that the ending is anything but prescriptive. It's not, if we do X, Y, Z, then everything will work out. Quite often, it's a complete subversion of that. And so I tend to gravitate towards fiction, A, because it's where I sit with questions, and B, it's because from a very young age, fiction has been my avenue of first retreat. So I left my home country when I was 5. And as a result, I don't really have a patriotic or nationalistic bone in my body. I have nothing against anybody who wants to salute the flag or has that kind of mindset, but they've lived a different life. And so, as a result, I tend to retreat from situations into the world of fiction where I can do things like, for example, take the eastern coast of Crete and manipulate it however I want. It's one of the things I do in a lot of my stories. American War, you open up that book and the first thing you see is a map of the US where Florida is underwater and the eastern seaboard is underwater and the capital has been moved from here to Columbus, Ohio, I think, because the sea levels have risen. And I mess around with geography, I think, as a natural sort of jumping off point from the kind of life I've had. And it was the same thing when I started thinking about this. I had a lot of questions that I didn't have answers to. If, for example, when I was doing research for this book, I don't know if this is still the case, but the human smugglers, the people who run these ships, they used to have Facebook pages. They used to run this like a small business. And I went to one of these things, and the big sort of background image of the Facebook page was a Carnival cruise ship. And they were trying to convince people that this is what's going to happen. You're going to eat lobster, and and of course the reality has nothing. That left me with more questions. That was the research period, and it left me with more questions about, like, who's the human being who put that picture up? What is it like to be? You hit the limits of your own empathy, and you hit the limits of your own experiential and sensory belief in the world very quickly. So the very rambling answer to your question is that I know I'm going in with questions that are going to remain questions at the end. And for me, whenever I'm in that position, I'm going to go into fiction because fiction doesn't punish the absence of answers. Whereas my editor at the newspaper absolutely is going to punish the absence of answers.
Thank you.
I would like to return to chapter 28 that you just read for us and highlight this one word. You write a lot, or you just spoke to us a lot about subversion, not providing answers. I would like to ask, what do you mean by a beautiful rebellion, to feel into another and to feel anything at all?
Yeah, so that entire chapter was written in a cabin in Newfoundland. There are certain literary festivals that will draw you in with money, and those are great, and I support them fully. I'm a very, very big fan of the sort of financial-based compensation model of literary festivals. And then there are places in Newfoundland who will lure you by telling you, hey, it's Newfoundland, we'll give you a cabin by the ocean. And that also is amazing. Anyway, I wrote that in one shot. It was one night I was sitting there alone in this cabin, and the only thing I knew was the space I was in my head. I knew this boat was going under, and I knew where I was psychologically, and I knew nothing else. And I was thinking about an essay I'd read about, it was an essay on Dostoevsky, on the last years of Dostoevsky's life. And as a tangent in this essay, this is being recorded, so if I'm getting this completely wrong, I'll be fact-checked to all hell, but I'm pretty sure this is true. The writer mentioned that the word empathy in the English language is only about 100 years old. It's a very, very recent word, and that it comes from the German, I think, Einfühlung, which literally translated means to feel into another. And I was thinking about that in the context of, I grew up on one side of the planet, but I was very much from a very young age, as you can tell by my accent, I was oriented towards the culture of this side of the planet. I grew up on Western movies, books, all of it. And it took me a long time to realize that there are facets of both cultures that I greatly, greatly underappreciated or sort of didn't think about deeply enough. And one of them is the incredibly individualistic nature of this part of the world, at least by my standards. This notion that you individually can do anything, and it's great, fantastic, and it's resulted in amazing sort of results, obviously. But when it comes to something like empathy, it goes to a really strange place, where it's like, I can feel into someone else's pain, and if I do it well enough, I can change things individually. And it just seemed strange to me. And so I was in this situation where I was describing the end of a very perilous journey of people who don't have any of these privileges. Not material privileges, but also not the psychological privilege of believing these things. And so it very quickly rooted me back to this idea of how necessary it is to feel into what someone else is feeling, and how much of a brick wall there is when it comes to individually turning that into communal action. And I was alone in a cabin in Newfoundland, and so 3 hours later, that ended up on the page.
So I'd love to continue exploring this intersection of kind of identity and empathy. And, it clearly, and by it I mean kind of identity, clearly plays a role in the works that you create, but it doesn't really limit you to strictly talking about your own experiences. So I wanted to ask, how have you navigated incorporating, bits and pieces of maybe yourself and your perspective into the book, while also exploring other experiences of things like gender or race or geography? To put it bluntly, like, how are you qualified to write this book? And alternatively, who else could be qualified to write What Strange Paradise?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating question, because that part about, are you qualified to do this? The short answer is no, absolutely not. And I spend a lot of time struggling with this because as a function of the subject matter that I'm drawn to, both as a journalist and then as a writer of fiction, and in fact, before a journalist, I wrote fiction well before I became a professional journalist, I am constantly drawn to be a tourist in someone else's misery. I mean, from the second I got to the Globe and Mail, I was bugging the foreign editor to put me on the Afghanistan rotation. I desperately, desperately wanted to get, because I wanted to write stories that I thought were consequential. I wanted to write stories that, if you didn't hear it from me, you wouldn't have heard it from somebody else. And for a long time, I was the tech business reporter, and I was writing Apple earnings, quarterly earnings stories. I'm sure there are many people in this room who care about Apple's quarterly earnings. I am not one of them. And also, if you haven't heard it from me, it's not like that's a secret, right? It's not like Apple's quarterly earnings are a secret. And finally, he agreed, and I was 24, 25 when I first went. I'd read way too much Hemingway. I had a very bizarre sense of what a war correspondent is and does. And very quickly, I realized it was all nonsense. It's complete nonsense. And one of my sort of defining experiences maybe a week into my first time in Afghanistan. I'd landed at the NATO airfield in Kandahar, which is the size of a small city at the time. This was 2007. And like a lot of the major bases, is protected by an inner wire and an outer wire. The inner wire protects the base proper, and the base proper has like a Burger King, and you know, it's like a town. And the inner wire is protected by NATO soldiers. So we're talking Westerners with state-of-the-art training, state-of-the-art equipment. The outer wire, there's then sort of a no man's land, and then there's the outer wire. The outer wire is right on the highway. It's the interface with the wider world. So by definition, if there's an attack, it's going to happen at the outer wire. If there's a suicide bombing, if there's a car bombing, it's going to happen. The people getting killed are... The outer wire is almost always, every one of these bases, protected by troops from Afghanistan. We're talking about 18-year-old kids, no training to speak of, weapons that the Soviets left behind, right? So you're looking at this, and you're looking at a hierarchy. You're very clearly looking at a hierarchy. Whatever you feel about this situation, or whether it's supposed to be like this or not, there is a ladder of who's going to die first. And that hit me, and I didn't know what to do with it. But I was very much cognizant from that point on. Then you go into Kandahar, for example, and you talk to people. I went out on a polio vaccination drive, and you're meeting people in the suburbs. And I am a tourist in someone else's misery. I have the central privilege. And the central privilege is the privilege to get up and leave. That's what I get to do. When I was in journalism, I could at least convince myself that the really ugly thing I was feeling was offset by the fact that maybe somebody on Parliament Hill would read the story the next day. And that or at the very least, I was putting it in the official archive of what happened, right? People could read this newspaper years and years from now. In fiction, that's a much harder sell, because you're still a tourist in someone else's misery. This has happened to somebody. This thing I'm fictionalizing has happened to many somebodies. But I can't even say that I'm doing this now in the journalistic interest. Now I have to believe that maybe in a broader artistic sense, it's going to change minds. And most of the time, that's absolutely not true. So I struggle with that. And usually when I'm talking about this, there's always an instinct to say, but what I figured out is, and then I haven't figured out anything. And I don't know if I can still keep doing this, because you have to lie to yourself and say that this thing that makes you feel like you need to go take a shower afterwards is doing something. And I don't know that it is. There's a lot of my experiences in this book. Amir and Vanna, the two central characters, don't speak each other's language, and so they're doing a lot of hand gestures. And how old are you? I'm 5. And I grew up in Qatar, which is a place that, when I grew up there, was 90% non-Qatari. 90% of the population had shown up to cash in on the oil and gas money. I'm almost certain it's still true to this day, but that was definitely true then. So when you're a kid on the beach or something and you meet another child, you instinctively sort of assume they don't speak your language, and you develop this. So a lot of that stuff is stolen and sort of put in there, as is the hierarchy of placelessness. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. We have it linguistically. You know, on one end of the spectrum, illegal, alien, economic migrant, and then you get all the way over here when, to be perfectly honest, it's a white Westerner in a place like Qatar. Now you're an expat. Now you're doing the place a favor by being here, by bringing your skill set. That's a very real, codified hierarchy of who matters more than who. All of that stuff, either quite literally or sort of metaphorically, also works its way into the book.
Thank you.
So you talk about being a tourist in someone else's misery. In the book itself, there is a large majority of that focuses on the tourists that are in this island. How do you think the stark contrast between these tourists who are in such denial about the refugee crisis and Amir and Vanna, how does this stark contrast contribute to your meaning of the novel?
Yeah, a lot of the stuff with the hotel and the sort of tourist aspect is also stolen from my time in Qatar. The reason we ended up in Qatar is because my dad found a job at the one hotel there. You go there now and it's like the dinkiest little hotel, but back in the 80s and 90s, there was one hotel in Qatar, and it was the Sheraton. And so I spent a lot of my time just sort of playing in the playgrounds there, and you get a really interesting sort of experience of a very sort of like bubble-wrapped way of being in the world. you talk to people who would come visit, not just Qatar, but everywhere I've lived, and they would always talk about this idea of wanting the authentic experience of the place. You know, I'm going to go out on the Dow and I'm going to go pearl diving and I'm going to see the Bedouin, true Bedouin culture. Also, please put me in this 5-star hotel where I'm fully insulated from the literally thousands of Pakistani and Indian laborers who are building this country as we speak with zero rights. And I think of that as such a sort of telling facet of the human experience, because you can see two colliding parts of somebody's psyche at work at once, which is that I am engaged in the world, I want to be fully engaged in the world. Also, like, I need the ramps up on the bowling lane because I'm not going to hit a gutter ball here. Like, I need you to fully close the spectrum down to what is acceptable to me. And again, this is a very cynical way of thinking about anything, thinking about tourism and all the rest of it, but I'd seen it repeated so many times that it couldn't help but bleed into. There's a scene in this book, for example, where, you know, the thing that is most important to these tourists is that, you know, the beach is going to open back up. This really unpleasant thing happened over there. But the important thing is, like, we don't have to go ask for a refund now because we got our beach back. I couldn't help but think about that throughout the construction of the book.
Thank you.
In one quote, you spoke about how a person freed of this instinct to kill somebody in war requires the full theater of war, its protective mythology, to do such a thing. Do you think empathy and how individualism ties in with empathy could be characterized as another protective mythology? And if so, what does it protect us from?
I differ a lot from a lot of writers I know on the issue of the usefulness of empathy, I think. A lot of the writers I admire have a much more sort of bleak view of what empathy can accomplish. And I think it comes down, at least to me anyway, about the difference between sort of hope as prologue and hope as epilogue. I think particularly in this part of the world, there's a privilege of believing in hope as constant epilogue, which is to say, no matter how badly we screw things up, the end, it's always going to work out. And that, to me, is not a particularly useful form of hope. And I think there's a lot of empathy that is tied to that. This is a thing I have to check off the list because it'll help things work out. And I don't know that that's particularly useful to me. Hope as prologue, hope as a starting point, is much more useful to me. And so it's a much more sort of conflicted idea of what empathy is. Yes, absolutely feel into somebody else's experience. But once you do that, do you feel now completely rid of any obligation to do anything else? And if so, what have we actually accomplished here? You felt bad. Okay, that's something. And I think one of the reasons that it's difficult to give a sort of clear-cut answer to this is because you're left in a very uncertain state. You know, we were talking about this earlier before the event. I was at a Zoom event for a climate fiction anthology, and the final question was, tell me where you get your hope from, which is the final question at so many book events about climate fiction. All of this, like, hope, where's hope? And everyone gave their sort of default, I see hope in this, I see hope in this. But the last guy to answer that question, his house had burned down in the California wildfires like a few weeks earlier. And he said, there is no hope. We've messed things up too much. We've screwed. But we must behave as though there is. And nobody knew what to do with that. Like, there was just this sort of weird silence on the Zoom meeting for a while. And then they were like, well, thank you very much for coming, everyone. And we kind of just moved on. But that person has been forced to think about hope and has been forced to think about empathy in a way that I wouldn't wish on anybody, but we are in that place now, right? So it's difficult for me to think of empathy as anything more than an offshoot of what that person is and what they're willing to do. And if that's all they're willing to do, then I don't know there's much to come of it.
All right, so thank you so much. And kind of as we wrap up with one last question here, so I'll be candid. I was going to ask you, a question about, empathy and change at the institutional level. But instead, I think I want to ask, for all the students here who may experience something similar to what I have, which is navigating a lot of contradiction. And in your interviews and within the book, contradiction is not something you're afraid of. There's quiet and loud, there's, mature and young, there's anger and feeling sedate. So do you have any advice, any words of wisdom, experience on just coping with contradiction, coping with no happy ending where you expected there to be one,
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to do the weird, it's going to sound like false humility and all the rest of that, but virtually everyone in this room is much smarter than me and destined for much greater things, and I feel very weird about the idea of sort of overt advice. I can tell you some of the things I would have liked to have heard when I was the age of most people in this room, but even that would be so hyper-specific as to be borderline useless. I think, when Ishiguro won the Nobel Prize, he gave his talk, and there's a line from that has stuck with me, which is that all literature is basically somebody saying, this is how it feels for me. Can you hear me? Does it also feel that way for you? And I think that's as good a definition of literature as I've heard. But I've also thought of what it means, right? Because you can get two answers to that question, yes or no, and both are useful. I have read, some of my favorite books have had nothing to do with my experience. And some have been very, very close to my experience, and some have been somewhere in the between, right? My favorite novel of all time is A Death in the Family by James Agee. I don't know anything about James Agee's upbringing. I did not have anything resembling, but my dad died suddenly. And this book is about a family where the dad dies suddenly, right? And so, you're in this room now with people who might have very similar experiences to you, might have experiences that are nothing like yours, might be somewhere in between. I can't tell you how to make a better world at all. I have a PhD in absolutely nothing. But I can tell you, at least in my sense, the fundamental prerequisite to a better world is engaging with each other's stories. Whether the answer to that question, does it also feel the same for you, is yes or no. Because every time you see somebody dehumanized, either individually or as a group, and we are seeing this now and we will see it in future years and we have seen it in the past, the fundamental prerequisite is to say, there are no stories here. Because from there you can say, there are no people here. There is something else, something lesser. And from that point, the worst things can happen. So engage with each other's stories. Don't worry about whether you agree with them or not. Don't worry about whether you believe the same things or not. This is your time to engage with one another, to engage with each other's stories. Whatever comes of that, you will be better for it. That would be my only piece of advice.
Thank you, Omar. Very powerfully and beautifully said and memorably said. Thank you, Aayush and Grace and Nami. We're now going to turn to questions from the whole group. There are microphones. Come to the microphone and come with a question. It should be a question and not a comment. Keep it concise, and we'll try to work through a number of questions in the next 25 minutes or so. While people come to the microphone, Omar, a few minutes ago you told me about the way the limits of empathy were, to some extent, enforced by the expectations of the publishing community with your two books. Are you willing to spell that out again for the group? The encounter that your publisher had with American War and then with this book and their sense of how it should be framed?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first book that I sold was this book called American War, which is a telling of a fictional Second American Civil War that takes place about 50 years from now. And I think because of the nature of the back of the book synopsis, when you look at the back of the book and says, this is what it's about, a lot of people thought that it was going to be the next Hunger Games. I mean, I found out that my book was on Amazon because a representative from Fox emailed me asking for the film rights. Because in Hollywood, they don't read the books, at all. They read the back of the book, and this sounded very... And then he read the book, and I never heard from him again, which made sense. But there was a sense that this thing was going to come out and be this big blockbuster. And by my standards, it did incredibly well, but it certainly wasn't that. The second book was not speculative. It didn't have the elements that made the first one seem so appealing. And so there were foreign publishers who said, we're no longer interested in the refugee crisis. If you'd given us this book in 2015, maybe then, there was that kind of response. There was a response of who's the readership for this, that kind of thing. And you very quickly come to learn that when you're alone writing the book, that is an artistic endeavor. And then one day you open the door and step into the commercial world, and it's an entirely different world. And so there was very sort of little enthusiasm for the book. And then the day it came out, it got a very positive review in the New York Times. And immediately I got an email from somebody at Penguin Random House saying, hey, what's your citizenship, by the way? Because immediately they were going to start submitting it for awards now that somebody had told them that maybe it wasn't a bad book. This is for all the aspiring writers in the world. This is the industry that you're headed towards. So just heads up, don't let it influence the actual art side of things.
I'm glad that they were proven wrong and that we've played our own small part in that process. So let's begin with the question at the microphone right here. Please identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Josh. I had a question about, so when you were speaking about American War, you talked about how the sort of audience reaction or, sometimes something in the book itself can reduce literature to become a kind of product of its time. I was wondering, what do you think makes literature have a kind of timeless quality, and what, if anything, is timelessness even worth?
That's a really interesting question. Thank you for that. I think that, I teach occasionally workshops, and when you teach workshops, you get pieces of writing that are nothing alike. People come in and you might get incredibly good writing, incredibly bad writing, memoir, but it's all over the place. And so I try to think of as broad a thing, as broad a metric as I can for good literature. Yeah. And I often go to the sort of airplane analogy. There are lots of great ways to fly a plane. You can do the Red Bull thing where you're doing flips in the air and all the rest of that. You can just get me from Portland to Seattle in one piece. That's also a great piece of flying. The one time I'm nervous is when the plane's doing something and I don't think the pilot intended for the plane to do that thing. And so I think about that in terms of literature in general is, am I thinking about this more deeply in the act of reading than the writer thought about it in the act of writing? If so, I'm probably out. Beyond that is just honesty. I think you can tell immediately. It's just a bad taste in your mouth when the author is being dishonest, when something is contrived. I remember reading a book that it was about this person who was going through some extreme depression and wanted to end their life. And the central scene on which it turned was someone sitting this person down and saying, can't you see how selfish you're being? And then this person being like, oh my God, you're right, I never thought of it this way. Maybe that person had that exact experience, I don't know. But something switched for me, right? There was a sense of like, oh, that something's off. Beyond that, I couldn't tell you a thing about, what makes it timeless. I can tell you that the book you write is one book. The book that is read is 1 million different books. And the story I go back to often, I'm sorry, I know there's a ton of questions. I will make these shorter, I promise. American War has a scene in the middle of the book that takes place in a refugee camp, and it's a very brutal scene based on the massacre at Sabra and Shatia. Sabra and Shatia is a Palestinian refugee camp. There was a massacre there 40 years ago. The scene is sort of photorealistic. And I would do book clubs, camp patience in the book. Patience, sabr is the Arabic word for patience, and so on and so forth. Nobody in this part of the world learns that in high school, right? So it's largely not understood here that that's the reference point. And so I would do book club events where people would say, inevitably, why did you have to make that scene so brutal? And I would say, well, this is actual witness testimony. I didn't make this up. And then I did a book club event virtually with an Egyptian book club who got the reference instantly. It was not far away for them. And the first question I got was, if this is based on Sabra and Shatia, why did you tone it down so much? Right? Like it was a different book that they read. So I think it's worth keeping that in mind when we talk about the idea of the timelessness of literature. The book you write is yours. The book everybody reads is everybody but yours. So get used to that notion.
Hi, thank you for coming and for that really interesting panel. My question kind of relates to what he was saying. My name is Zaid, by the way. As someone who, based on your talk today, has kind of centered his life around trying to make a difference, trying to bring other people's stories into people's lives, and who's today been very candid about wondering whether continuing to write journalism, what you've been doing so far with your life, will make a difference and, what complete your, goal, your objective. What are you thinking about for the future, and what would you say to all these people in the crowd, who many of whom I'm sure all have similar goals to yours, who want to make some kind of difference in the world?
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I remember being on the other end of these talks, and the speaker saying something to the extent of like, "Yeah, we've screwed things up real bad, but your generation, you're gonna, And now I'm sitting here being like, man, we've screwed things up so bad, but your generation. And so there's a natural sense of hypocrisy on my part to try and assume how it is you are going to engage with quite literally the biggest challenge the species has ever faced, right? That's not a small thing, right? To be in a place where the planet is changing in a way that may make it uninhabitable for us. That's not a small thing. One of the reasons early on in this talk I led with this idea of thinking about what you don't have to put up with, what you don't have to think about, the privilege of consequence-free obliviousness to something, is because that negative space follows you around. And so there is no doubt in my mind that the people in this room are going to change the world for the better. One of the sort of prerequisites to that is understanding the position you are starting from, the various lotteries that you might have won or lost. We have lots of research on the idea that one of the central determinants of success is the zip code you're born into, your choice of parents, which is no choice at all, right? I'm not one of those people who expects anyone here who comes from money or who comes from that kind of background to constantly be apologizing for it left, right, and center. I don't care. I think it is very, very important, if you are interested in engaging with the world and changing the world, to be keenly aware of the active and negative sides of your own existence. And so that includes, what do I not have to worry about? I think that makes it a lot easier to think about the world and your place in the world as an agent for change. Otherwise, you might end up in a situation where your intentions are fantastic, and who cares? Right? Congratulations, you've done the things a good person would do. You can think. So that's sort of how I think about it, but that's not especially useful, especially given that I was on the other side of this conversation, and here we are.
Hi, my name is Renatka. As a journalist, have you ever felt anything like the journalist in What Strange Paradise who poked and prodded around the banks of disaster with cameras and notebooks? They were recording for the sake of media rather than because of their empathy. Despite your lived experiences and your empathy, have you ever felt ashamed or disrespectful to be witnessing catastrophe but never living it?
Yes, constantly, in a million different ways. Some very structural and overarching, both my trips to Afghanistan, which was some of the best journalism I did. I'm not saying I was an amazing journalist, but the best journalism I did do was from Afghanistan, was from Guantanamo Bay, was from Ferguson, Missouri. I landed there the night after the jury decided not to indict the guy who killed Mike Brown. And I saw echoes of what I had seen in Egypt a couple of years earlier. Very militarized police presence. This ridiculous equivalence between the destruction of human life and the destruction of property, as though those two things were equal and offsetting. So there were moments where structurally I felt like I was in the middle of a system of injustice. And I was taking my little photos and I was doing my write-up, and I don't think I was... But then also you get very, very individual specific moments. I started as a GA, general assignment, which is basically when you take the young reporters and it's just like whatever the hell's happening that day, send Omar off. So it's car crashes, it's house fires, it's also a lot of murders, it's also a lot of violent crime. And so you're standing there on somebody's doorstep and they've just gone through the worst thing possible, right? They've just lost a lot. And you're knocking on the door and you're saying, please talk to me now, a stranger, so that I can put it in the paper and my editor will be very proud of me. And if I get a detail that the competing paper doesn't get, maybe it'll help my career. And again, you have to convince yourself that, like, yes, they're very upset, but this is the permanent record, so I need to do this because we need to put it in. The public needs to know. Do they? Does the public right now really need me to be knocking on the door of somebody who's just gone through the worst thing? Some journalists have the ability to turn that off, and this is my job, I'm just going to do it. And I was never one of those. And it was actually the moment where I realized that in the long term I couldn't be a journalist anymore, because the way it messed with me was not something I was going to kill off. And I knew other journalists who were very good people, and I'm not judging them, but they were able to turn that off. But yes, it happened almost constantly.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Remy. So you mentioned earlier in your talk how you would like to approach this story with a pre-existing story structure, and where most stories would take that story left, you took right. Now the story has that almost circular ending where we return to the first chapter at the very end of the book, only this time it seems like Amir is lying dead rather than being alive, breaking that cyclical kind of structure that the dual plot lines gives us that feeling of all throughout the story. Did you have a particular intent behind that moment? Was it something you had at the beginning of the writing process, or something that sort of developed as you were going?
Yeah, thematically I had that intent from the beginning. Structurally I didn't. The before and after construction doesn't show up until halfway through the draft. So What Strange Paradise went through, I think, eight rewrites, 8 drafts. And those are front to back rewrites, I mean substantial. And it was only around draft 4 or 5 that the before and after structure showed up. But thematically I knew from the very beginning that what I wanted to do was push a particular kind of hopefulness to its breaking point. I wanted to see how much a reader's capacity to believe everything's going to work out would go. And as you go further into this story, the things that are happening are pushing that. You know, you get to one of the last chapters and the central villain in the story is now speaking flawless Arabic. What the hell's going on? This is a Greek guy, why is he speaking? And I was pushing it, and then we get to that final paragraph, final chapter, and I sort of break it, right? I thought the trick was fairly straightforward, and then the first 4 people to read the manuscript, my agent, 2 of her friends, and an editor, had 4 entirely different interpretations of what the hell was happening in this book. And that's when I knew that I was in for the same ride that I had with American War. We were talking about this earlier. Because I'm a deeply insecure person, I will Google the title of my book quite often to see what people are saying. And Google has that autocomplete thing. And so one of the first suggestions that you see when you type in What Strange Paradise is, did you mean What Strange Paradise ending explained? So clearly people are having a rough go with this, right? I had someone email me saying, thank you so much for that very hopeful ending where the man is moving the necklace out of the way so he can raise this child up. And I was like, man, I hope there's more people like you in the world, like more power to you, you know? It's, you fully lose control of what it is people, I mean, one of the people who blurbed the book gave this amazing blurb where I read it and I was just like, thank you so much, I don't know what book you just read. Like, it was just so far removed. And you have to come to terms with that. But thematically, that was my intent, was to sort of push that hopefulness and see how far the reader was willing to take it.
Thank you.
Omar, before we go to the next question, he just said something that's really staggering here. The structure of this book, before and after, that is not only utterly natural in the reading of the book, but it's hard to imagine the book without it, emerged more than halfway through the process?
Yeah, this is the terrifying thing. Whenever I talk to students about this sort of stuff, I get the sort of like, oh no. Yeah, there was 8 drafts, and the thing that made it work didn't show up. I mean, it was not working before that, so I had to go through 4 drafts on faith.
Which is a year, or?
It was about a year and a half, I think.
Wow.
Something like that. American War, similar situation, 12 drafts, 12 rewrites. Both books had a 30,000 word wrong turn, where I wrote, for the first book I thought, hey, I want the central character's diaries. I'm going to write them all out for the entirety of her life. 30,000 words later, not a word of it was usable. So that all went. With this one I thought, hey, let's write monologues from the point of view of everyone on the boat. 30,000 words later, not a word of it was usable. You have to kind of, if I win marathons, it's not because I'm a fast runner, it's because I have a high tolerance for blisters. There's a valley of creation where at the beginning you're in this honeymoon period and everything feels new and it's amazing, and that'll carry you through. And at the end you can see the finish line, and that'll carry you through. When you're down here and you're on draft 10 and you know there might be another 10 to go, that's when most people leave. And so if you're interested in this kind of work, maybe you have natural talent, I have no idea what that's like, maybe you don't, whatever. It's the stubbornness that will get you out of that valley, nothing else. So keep that in mind if you're doing something really intensive in the creative field. It gets better, but it gets real bad too. So.
Thank you. Back to the class of 2028.
Hi, I'm Francesca. And while reading the book, I was kind of intrigued by the fact that although the island is Greek, there are also a lot of elements to it that are like kind of ambiguously European. And I was wondering whether it was your intention while you were writing to create sort of a statement about the broader response of Europe to the migrant crisis in the Mediterranean, and like if you could speak to that, because it was just something that like really kind of spoke to me.
Yeah, thank you for that. There was an element of that, of trying to be antagonistic, I suppose, in a literary sense. I'm going to change this around. But on top of that, I often think a lot about lineage, literary lineage. So if you grew up in this part of the world and you write in this lineage, that is an established canon, right? We have the Greeks and Shakespeare, and we work our way through, and that provides certain benefits, right? Hemingway can call his book "The Sun Also Rises" and not be afraid that people aren't going to get that reference. The Bible is not an obscure text. If you're pulling from different lineages, you almost have to go into that uncertain space by definition. The example I always go back to, and it's the silliest example, and I apologize, but I think it gets to what I'm talking about. Early on in the book, there's a nightclub that keeps playing the same rap song over and over again, and Vanna's pissed off about it. And I never quite explained what this is, but if you read between the lines of the description of the song, it's Big Pimpin' by Jay-Z, right? Fast forward to the other end of the book. The boat is nearing the island, somebody hears music, and one of the Arabs says, "Our people are nearby." That reference makes absolutely no sense unless you know that Big Pimpin' samples a mid-20th century Egyptian pop song called Khosara Khosara. The number of people whose cultural knowledge base includes Jay-Z's back catalog and mid-20th century Egyptian pop is me and two other people, basically, right? And so you have to decide. There's a fork in the road. You either make this stuff overt, and then it's sort of like wide but shallow. People get it, or you don't, and then it's narrow but deep, right? And I've very much decided that I wasn't going to explain these things. And you're kind of walking an impossible tightrope. You fall on one side, you've made it too overt, now it's bad writing. You fall on the other side, it's as though it was never there because nobody saw it in the first place. I've just decided to sort of fall on that side of the tightrope, but that's all over the book. There's so many places in the book where I did that. And the way I've sort of manipulated the island is definitely falls into that category.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
We have time for two more brief questions.
Hello, my name's Corbin, and I had a question on the character of Kethros. Kethros acts as a Captain Hook and an antagonist in Amir and Vanna's story. One of our questions that were asked on the book discusses the reality of his bleak ideology. To you, is Kethros's perspective on the tragedy of the book something you believe yourself, or is its sole purpose to be a pessimistic contrast of Amir's hopeful "what if I survive" story? How much of his perspective do you see as the truth for you, whether it be flakes of truth or true in its entirety?
Yeah, thank you for that. I don't agree with almost anything any of my characters have to say. Weirdly enough, I can see where the villains are coming from easier than... That's something I should probably take up with my therapist more than anything else. But Kethros is... when I was in high school, I had a physics teacher who was obsessed with this idea that you should never memorize formulas. You should be able to derive them from basic principles, right? I'll give you distance and speed, and I think of Kethros as somebody who's sort of memorized a certain set of formulas about what makes a man, strong handshake, firm, that sort of thing, but has no idea how to derive them from basic principles of decency or kindness. And so you get this person who has a very thin veneer of understanding of the world, and anytime reality pierces it, all that's holding it up is violence. That's what he resorts to. And so you get a scene like when he sees that girl who's drowning, and he goes and does the very chivalrous thing of taking her, and then afterwards hits her father for not showing enough decorum in the moment, right? I think of him as a deeply broken person, and he's also, I don't steal whole people, but I steal slivers of people. And so he is slivers of the men I grew up around, who had a very sort of purposeful, but ultimately kind of vacant understanding of this is what makes a good, strong man. And you think, okay, after the firm handshake and the looking people in the eye, and what does this actually mean? And I don't think Kethros has an answer for that, and I think it's deeply troubling for him because he has chosen a profession for himself that demands a kind of certainty he doesn't intrinsically have. And it just happens to be the profession where they give you a gun. So it's a very sort of volatile situation that his entire life has been.
Oh, okay, thank you. I really appreciate, like, that made me appreciate the writing behind his character a lot more, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you all for your time. There is so much luck when it comes to survival, especially for someone that has come from a family that immigrated to this country. And I was wondering, how do you try to incorporate luck in your writing and incorporate that into a story that is ultimately about going to a country that does not want you there?
That's a really good question, and I've thought about it a ton, which is going to make the unsatisfactory nature of my answer even more unsatisfactory because I haven't come to any sort of clean conclusions. Luck is a very difficult thing to apply a narrative structure to. You know, narrative structure is sort of the comedy or the hero's journey, the tragedy, you know, that sort of thing. You know, my dad had to get the hell out of Egypt when I was 5 years old, and he found a job in Libya. And so we were getting ready to go to Libya. And he gets there, and the way that Arabic names work is that my middle name is his first name, his middle name is his father. And so his name is Muhammad Ahmed, and Muhammad Ahmed is an incredibly common combination. It turns out that there's a guy on the Libyan terrorism watch list with the same name. So he's denied entry into Libya. And a couple of months later, he gets a job in Qatar, which over the next few years is going to become the richest country on earth. I end up growing up in the richest country on earth, and I sound like this because I've gone to British and American schools ever since, instead of Libya, because of a case of mistaken identity at the airport, right? And that has influenced the trajectory of my life more than anything I have ever achieved, more than my university degree, more than the books, anything. And I had zero say in it. How do you write that? And how do you write that from a place where you have ended up in a place where there is a narrative construct for the immigrant, which is perpetually grateful? You know, I don't know. I genuinely don't know. And so every piece of work, not just the novels, but the short stories, the things I gravitate to in the world of nonfiction, are all about this idea of how the hell do I make sense of this when none of the narrative structures seem to apply to my existence? That is my very rambling way of saying I have no good answer to your question, and I'm so sorry.
It's okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. And for those who have questions, there will be a reception with Omar tomorrow in the midday in Lao. Thanks again to the student interlocutors and to Omar, and over to you now, Provost Groves, for final remarks.
I'm actually going to repeat some of what Paul just said because it deserves repeating. I want to thank you for being here, both to illustrate, explicate your thinking about the book, but also to teach us universal truths. Thank you so much, Omar. And Grace, Nami, and Aayush, your conversations with our author illustrate exactly what we aspire to be as learners in this world that we inhabit. I want to remind you from 1 o'clock to 3 o'clock at Launger Library, this man will appear. Bring your books. He has agreed to sign his name on your own copy of the book. And maybe he has a little time to engage in those that had some other questions that we weren't able to entertain. I want to thank all of you for being here. This 2024 edition of the Marino Family Workshop, we treasure. We hope this was meaningful to you, and we hope you learned some lessons that you may put into practice over the coming days. We wish you the best for this, your first semester at Georgetown. Thanks for coming.